Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that might change how you think about ancient trade. When you picture the Silk Road, you probably see camel caravans plodding across endless desert dunes, don't you? Merchants wrapped in flowing robes, bells jingling, dust swirling in the heat. It's the image we've all been sold. But what if I told you that the real heavy lifting of ancient global commerce, the bulk of the goods, the wealth, the ideas that truly connected civilizations, happened not on sand but on water? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The myth of the desert road, the Silk Road. The name itself conjures romance and adventure. It's been featured in countless documentaries, history books, and travel programs. The image is always the same. Those long camel trains crossing the Taklamakan Desert, merchants trading at Samarkand and Bukhara, precious silk making its way westward while gold and glass headed east. And yes, that happened. All of it. But here's what they don't tell you in those documentaries. The desert route was dangerous, slow, and limited in capacity. A camel can carry maybe 400 pounds if you're generous. Now multiply that by a caravan of, say, 50 camels. That's 20,000 pounds of cargo, assuming none of the camels die along the way, and they did die regularly from thirst, exhaustion, or getting lost in sandstorms. The journey from Chang'an in China to the Mediterranean could take more than a year, often longer. Bandits were a constant threat. Water sources were unreliable. Political situations changed with alarming frequency, meaning routes that were safe one season might be deadly the next. Compare that to a ship. Even a relatively modest vessel from the Tang Dynasty period, we're talking 7th to 9th century here, could carry 20 to 30 tons of cargo. That's 40 to 60,000 pounds. A single ship could carry what would require 100 to 150 camels on land, and it could make the journey from Chinese ports to the Persian Gulf in a matter of months, not years, assuming favorable monsoon winds. Those who served in the Navy will understand the mathematics immediately. When you need to move bulk goods across vast distances, water beats land every single time. But here's where it gets interesting. This maritime network, this vast web of sea lanes connecting China to Africa and everything in between, has been largely forgotten in popular imagination. Ask someone about the Silk Road, and they'll tell you about Marco Polo and desert oases. Ask them about the Maritime Silk Road, and you'll usually get a blank stare. Tonight, we're going to correct that oversight. We're going to explore the real engine of ancient global trade, the sea routes that connected civilizations, spread religions, transformed economies, and moved more goods in a single voyage than months of desert caravans could manage. We're going to visit the great port cities that made this possible, meet the merchants and mariners who risked everything on monsoon winds and unknown waters, and understand how this vast maritime network shaped the world we inherited. And we're going to do it slowly, thoroughly, with all the detail and texture that history deserves. Because these weren't just trade routes. They were highways of human connection, ambition, and innovation that spanned thousands of miles of open ocean, driven by winds that blew with predictable regularity, maintained by navigators who read stars and currents, and sustained by merchants who understood something fundamental. Water connects, while desert divides. Monsoon masters, nature's highway system. Before we board any ships or visit any ports, we need to understand the engine that powered this entire maritime network. Not coal, not diesel, not even human muscle. Wind. But not just any wind. highly predictable seasonal winds that mariners learned to read like a giant clock spanning the Indian Ocean and beyond. The monsoon system. If you've never encountered the term in its original context, it comes from the Arabic mawsim, meaning season. And these weren't gentle breezes. These were reliable, powerful winds that reversed direction twice a year with remarkable consistency. From April to October, the southwest monsoon blew from Africa toward India and onward to Southeast Asia. From November to March, the northeast monsoon reversed course, blowing back from Asia toward Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. Think about what this meant. A merchant in Canton, that's Guangzhou to modern mapmakers, could load his ship in March or April, catch the southwest monsoon, and ride it all the way to India or even the Arabian Peninsula. He'd arrive in time for the trading season, sell his goods, purchase local products, and then wait. Come November, the wind would reverse, and he'd sail home on the northeast monsoon, arriving back in Canton by early spring. The whole round trip, if managed well, could be done in a single year. This wasn't speculation or hoping for favorable winds. This was a transit system that operated with such reliability that merchants could plan years in advance. Ships would gather in ports, waiting for the monsoon shift, knowing almost to the week when it would come. Those who served in the Pacific during the war understood weather patterns. You learned when typhoon season hit, when conditions favored or opposed operations. This was the same principle, but on an even more predictable schedule. The monsoons created what we might today call a conveyor belt of commerce. Ships moving southwest carried Chinese silks, porcelain, tea, and later finished goods. Ships moving northeast brought back spices, precious stones, pearls, exotic woods, and raw materials. The wind itself was the engine, the force that made long-distance bulk trade not just possible, but economically viable. But here's what made ancient mariners true masters. They didn't just wait for the monsoons. They learned to read subtleties within the larger pattern. They understood that the monsoon wasn't uniform. It varied in strength and timing depending on latitude. They knew the smaller coastal winds that could help or hinder navigation. They developed techniques for tacking and maneuvering that could take advantage of even unfavorable conditions. Arab and Indian sailors, in particular, became legendary for their understanding of these winds. They developed the dhow, that distinctive vessel with its triangular lateen sail, specifically optimized for monsoon navigation. The design allowed them to sail closer to the wind than square-rigged vessels, giving them more flexibility in route selection and timing. They weren't just passengers on the monsoon. They were active participants, manipulating wind and current to achieve their goals. The knowledge required wasn't simple. Mariners had to learn star navigation, understanding which stars rose and set at different latitudes. They had to master dead reckoning, estimating speed and distance traveled. They needed to recognize cloud patterns that indicated land beyond the horizon, to read the color and temperature of water for clues about currents and depth, to observe bird flight patterns that suggested nearby islands or coastlines. This knowledge was transmitted orally, from master to apprentice, in traditions that stretched back centuries. There were no GPS coordinates, no weather satellites, no radio communications. Just accumulated wisdom, careful observation, and an intimate understanding of the ocean and its moods. The Pacific submariners among you will understand what it means to navigate by skill and experience when technology fails. These ancient mariners operated that way by default, and they did it across thousands of miles of open ocean, successfully, repeatedly, for centuries. Consider the sophistication required. A Chinese captain leaving Canton for Calicut in southwest India had to time his departure to catch the beginning of the southwest monsoon, navigate through the South China Sea, avoiding typhoons and pirates, make landfall at various ports along the Malay Peninsula, cross the Bay of Bengal, one of the most challenging bodies of water in the world, and arrive at Calicut when the trading season was in full swing. Then he had to do it all in reverse 6 months later. And they did, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. The monsoons never failed them. Oh, individual ships might be lost to storms or navigational errors, but the system itself was reliable. It was this reliability that built empires, funded dynasties, and connected civilizations that otherwise would have remained isolated by vast distances and dangerous terrain. The Desert Silk Road gets the glory in popular imagination, but those who understand logistics and large-scale operations will immediately recognize which system was more efficient. A single good monsoon season moved more goods across the Indian Ocean than a year's worth of camel caravans could move across the desert. And it did so with far less human suffering, far fewer losses, and far greater profitability. The monsoons were nature's gift to global commerce, and ancient mariners were smart enough to accept that gift and master its use. Ships built for distance, engineering on water. The monsoons provided the power, but you can't harness wind without the right vessel. And this is where ancient shipbuilding becomes genuinely fascinating, not because it was primitive, but because it was remarkably sophisticated, developing solutions to engineering problems that European shipbuilders wouldn't figure out for centuries. Chinese junks were marvels of practical design. Those who have worked with their hands, built anything that had to withstand stress and weather, will appreciate what Chinese shipwrights achieved. The junk featured watertight compartments, bulkheads that divided the hull into separate sections. If one compartment sprung a leak, the others remained dry. The ship could survive damage that would sink a vessel with an open hull. This wasn't just clever, it was revolutionary. European ships wouldn't adopt this technology until the 19th century, more than 1,000 years after Chinese builders had perfected it. The sails themselves were engineering achievements. Chinese junks used batten sails, horizontal battens of bamboo spaced every few feet up the sail's height. This created a sail that could be raised or lowered in sections, giving the crew tremendous control. Lose wind, lower part of the sail, wind too strong, drop the upper sections while keeping the lower ones deployed. This flexibility made Chinese vessels safer and more maneuverable than rigid square sails used elsewhere. The rudder was another innovation. Chinese ships mounted a stern rudder centuries before anyone else. European ships were still using side-mounted steering oars when Chinese vessels had fully developed stern rudders that could be raised or lowered depending on water depth. This gave Chinese ships better control in shallow coastal waters and superior steering in deep ocean swells. Ship size varied considerably. Coastal traders might be modest vessels of 50 to 100 tons, suitable for regional routes and river mouths. Ocean-going junks easily reached 200 to 500 tons. And then there were the great treasure ships of the Ming Dynasty's voyages in the early 15th century. Historical records claim some measured over 400 feet in length and displaced more than 1,500 tons. Even if we allow for some exaggeration, historians always debate exact measurements. These were clearly massive vessels by any standard, ancient or modern. Now let's sail west to the Indian Ocean, where different maritime traditions produced different solutions. Arab dhows used sewn plank construction. Instead of nails or pegs, planks were literally sewn together with coconut fiber rope, threaded through holes drilled along the edges. This sounds primitive until you understand the engineering logic. In areas where iron was expensive and wood plentiful, sewn construction made economic sense. More importantly, sewn planks created a hull with some flexibility, allowing the vessel to work with ocean swells rather than fighting against them. The hull could flex slightly under stress without cracking or opening seams. The dhow's lateen sail, that large triangular sail hung from a long yard, was optimized for the conditions it faced. The design allowed the ship to sail closer to the wind than square sails, crucial for navigating coastlines and harbors where wind direction might not be favorable. The triangular shape also made it easier to handle in sudden wind shifts, a matter of survival in tropical waters where squalls could appear with little warning. Indian Ocean vessels varied by region. Kerala in southern India produced Uru vessels, similar to dhows but with their own distinctive features. Sri Lankan ships specialized in shallow draft designs suitable for navigating reef-protected harbors. Indonesian shipbuilders developed jong vessels that could carry hundreds of passengers and tons of cargo, with hull designs optimized for Southeast Asian waters. What tied all these designs together wasn't uniformity, it was appropriateness. Each maritime culture developed vessels suited to their local conditions, available materials, and specific trading routes. Chinese junks were built for the typhoon-prone waters of the South China Sea and the long ocean passages to Southeast Asia and India. Arab dhows were optimized for the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, and Indian Ocean's western reaches. Indian Ocean vessels reflected the diverse conditions and materials available along thousands of miles of coastline. Those who have worked on mechanical systems understand that different solutions can be equally valid depending on circumstances. You don't use the same tool for every job. Ancient shipbuilders understood this instinctively. They weren't trying to build the best ship in some abstract sense. They were building the right ship for specific waters, specific cargoes, and specific trade routes. And here's what often gets overlooked. These vessels were maintained and operated by crews who understood their ships intimately. A junk captain knew every plank, every rope, every idiosyncrasy of his vessel. He could feel through his feet when the ship was riding well or struggling. He understood how much sail to carry in different conditions, when to reef down, when to run before the wind, when to seek shelter. The ship was a tool, but also a partner in the dangerous business of ocean trade. Navigation tools were surprisingly sophisticated. Chinese mariners used the magnetic compass by the 11th century, possibly earlier. They maintained detailed rudders, written sailing directions describing landmarks, depths, distances, currents, and seasonal conditions for specific routes. Arab navigators developed the camel, a simple but effective device for measuring the altitude of stars above the horizon, allowing them to determine latitude with reasonable accuracy. These weren't the hulking steel vessels we think of today. These were wooden ships held together with rope, resin, and the skill of craftsmen. They leaked. They required constant maintenance. Planks needed replacing. Rigging wore out. Sails tore and had to be repaired. But they worked. For centuries they worked, carrying the commerce that connected civilizations and built empires. When you step onto a modern container ship, everything is steel, diesel, radar, GPS, satellite communications. The ancient mariner had wood, rope, wind, and knowledge passed down through generations. The fact that they successfully crossed thousands of miles of open ocean, repeatedly, year after year, tells you something about human ingenuity and determination. They weren't reckless. They were professional sailors who understood their craft and respected the ocean that sustained and threatened them in equal measure. Canton, China's gateway to the world. Now let's board a ship and start our journey. We'll begin where silk began, at the eastern terminus of the Maritime Silk Road, in the sprawling port city of Canton, known today as Guangzhou. If you visited Canton in, say, 1100 CE during the Song Dynasty, you'd find one of the world's busiest harbors, a place where Chinese civilization met the wider world on terms largely dictated by Chinese power and wealth. The Pearl River Delta provided Canton with a natural advantage, deep water access leading inland to Chinese production centers, protected harbors, and excellent connections to both river and canal systems. Merchants from across Asia knew that if you wanted Chinese goods in quantity and quality, Canton was where you went. Not might go, had to go. The Chinese controlled supply and they knew it. Picture the scene. Hundreds of ships crowded the harbor at any given time. Chinese junks of all sizes, from coastal traders to ocean-going vessels capable of reaching India or even Africa. Arab dhows making the long voyage from the Persian Gulf. Ships from Southeast Asia, Java, Sumatra, the Malay Peninsula, bringing goods from throughout the region. Indian vessels from the Malabar and Coromandel coasts. It was a maritime United Nations, centuries before that term would exist. The city's warehouses were massive structures, many rising 3 or 4 stories, their interiors divided into compartments for different goods. Silk occupied entire warehouses, raw silk, woven silk, embroidered silk, silk of every imaginable grade and color. Other warehouses stored porcelain, that miracle of Chinese ceramic technology that the rest of the world couldn't duplicate. Tea in compressed bricks or loose leaf. Metalwork from bronze mirrors to iron implements. Lacquerware that could take months to produce a single piece. The organization was impressive. Song Dynasty, Canton had a government office specifically dedicated to managing foreign trade, the Shibosi, or Office of Maritime Trade. This wasn't informal commerce at the docks. This was bureaucratic administration of international trade, complete with tariffs, inspections, licensed merchants, and careful record-keeping. Foreign merchants had designated areas where they could live and conduct business. There were interpreters, currency exchangers, brokers who facilitated deals between parties speaking different languages. Chinese authorities weren't interested in free trade in the modern sense. They wanted control, revenue, and order. Foreign merchants paid substantial tariffs on both imports and exports. In exchange, they got access to goods they couldn't obtain anywhere else, and the protection of Chinese commercial law within the city's boundaries. Pirates were a problem at sea, but in Canton's harbor, Chinese naval presence and strict harbor regulations meant your cargo was relatively safe once you made landfall. The city itself reflected this commercial success. Canton during the Song Dynasty was wealthy, cosmopolitan, and sophisticated. Its population included permanent communities of Arab, Persian, Indian, and Southeast Asian merchants who'd settled there, sometimes for generations. There were mosques for Muslim traders, temples for various Buddhist and Hindu sects, and inevitably the mixing of cultures that happens when people live and work together despite different origins. Those who remember international ports during the post-war years, places where cultures mixed, where you heard a dozen languages on any street corner, where the food reflected global influences. That was Canton 1,000 years ago. Restaurants catered to foreign tastes. Interpreters did brisk business. Brokers who understood both Chinese and foreign business practices made fortunes facilitating deals. But here's what made Canton truly central to the Maritime Silk Road. It was where goods accumulated from all over China before being shipped abroad. The silk wasn't produced in Canton. It came from inland regions, transported via river and canal. The porcelain came from Jingdezhen and other ceramic centers, brought to Canton for export. Tea came from inland plantations. Canton was an aggregation point, where China's diverse production concentrated before being dispersed across the maritime network. Return ships brought goods that China wanted or needed. Southeast Asian spices and exotic woods. Indian cotton. China produced silk, but Indian cotton was finer than Chinese varieties. Precious stones from Sri Lanka and Burma. Pearls from the Persian Gulf. Frankincense and myrrh from Arabia. Raw materials like tin and copper. And always, silver and gold, precious metals that China's economy consumed in vast quantities. The scale of commerce was substantial. Tax records from the Song dynasty show that revenue from maritime trade became a significant portion of government income. One estimate suggests that at Canton's peak, maritime customs revenue exceeded income from the overland Silk Road by a factor of 5 or more. That's not speculation based on scattered evidence. That's from actual government tax records that survived. For a foreign merchant, Canton represented both opportunity and challenge. The opportunity was obvious: access to goods that commanded premium prices anywhere in the world. Chinese silk in Baghdad or Alexandria could sell for many times its purchase price in Canton. Porcelain was literally worth its weight in silver in some markets. The challenge was equally obvious: dealing with Chinese bureaucracy, paying substantial tariffs, competing with other merchants, and then successfully transporting your goods thousands of miles back home. Success wasn't guaranteed. Ships were lost to storms. Cargoes could be damaged by water or spoilage. Pirates operated in waters between major ports. Political situations changed, dynasties fell, new regulations appeared, wars disrupted trade routes. The merchants who succeeded weren't just lucky. They were skilled businessmen who understood risk management, maintained reliable networks of contacts, built reputations for honest dealing, and had enough capital to absorb occasional losses without going bankrupt. Canton wasn't the only Chinese port involved in maritime trade, but it was consistently the largest and most important. Other ports like Quanju, Zayton to Arab geographers, and Ningbo also handled substantial trade, but Canton's position at the mouth of the Pearl River, its proximity to southern Chinese production centers, and its long-established mercantile infrastructure made it the natural primary gateway. When you think about the Silk Road, this is where you should start your imagination, not in a dusty desert caravansary, but in a bustling port city where ships from across Asia gathered, where goods from China's interior accumulated before dispersing to the wider world, where different cultures met in pursuit of profit, where the real heavy lifting of ancient global trade occurred. Canton wasn't romantic in the Marco Polo sense. It was commercial, organized, bureaucratic, and enormously profitable. In other words, it was real. Through the South China Sea, pirates and perils. Leaving Canton with a hold full of silk and porcelain was just the beginning. Now came roughly 1,500 miles of navigation through the South China Sea, past the coast of what we'd now call Vietnam, through the dangerous waters around the Malay Peninsula, and eventually into the Strait of Malacca, one of the world's most strategic maritime choke points then and now. This wasn't a pleasure cruise. The South China Sea earned its reputation as one of the world's more challenging bodies of water. Typhoons were a constant threat, particularly from July to November. These weren't the tropical storms we casually discuss on weather forecasts. These were maritime apocalypse events, winds that could shred sails, waves tall enough to swamp even large vessels, rain so heavy you couldn't see the bow from the stern. Smart captains knew the seasons and planned accordingly. You didn't sail the South China Sea during peak typhoon season unless you had no choice. Even during supposedly safer months, squalls could appear with terrifying speed. One moment, calm seas and steady wind. An hour later, fighting for your life as the sky turned black and the ocean tried its best to kill you. But typhoons weren't the only threat. Pirates infested these waters like mosquitoes in a swamp. And we're not talking about romantic pirates from adventure novels. These were hard men operating from hidden bases along the coast, preying on merchant traffic with ruthless efficiency. They knew the waters intimately, understood which routes merchants had to use, and picked their targets carefully. A heavily loaded merchant vessel, sitting low in the water, moving slowly, that was a juicy target. Pirates operated fast, lightly loaded vessels that could overtake a merchant ship, board before help could arrive, and disappear with cargo and often the ship itself before any naval patrol could respond. The pirates weren't interested in fighting. They wanted quick, profitable raids with minimum risk. Merchants developed various defensive strategies. Travel in groups was common. A half-dozen ships together were far less vulnerable than a single vessel. Some merchants armed their crews and built defensive structures on their ships. Governments organized naval patrols, though coverage was always spotty over such vast areas. But ultimately, piracy was a cost of doing business, factored into prices and insurance arrangements. Those who served in Pacific waters during the war understood island chains and coastal complexity. The South China Sea coast was a maze of islands, inlets, river mouths and channels where 100 pirate vessels could hide and local authorities would never find them. It wasn't that governments didn't try to suppress piracy. They did regularly. But the geography favored the pirates, and new crews always emerged to replace those captured or killed. Navigation through this section required constant attention. Reefs and shoals were numerous and poorly charted. Running aground meant, at best, waiting for high tide and hoping the hull hadn't been holed. At worst, it meant watching your ship break apart while you scrambled for safety. Experienced pilots who knew specific stretches of coast were valuable commodities, often picked up at major ports and carried along until their local knowledge was no longer needed. The coast offered some safe harbors, Chinese-controlled ports like Hainan Island, Vietnamese coastal cities, and eventually the established trading posts along the Malay Peninsula. Ships would stop at these intermediate ports to take on fresh water, repair damage, trade for local goods, and get information about conditions ahead. These weren't just service stops. They were nodes in the maritime network, each contributing to the overall system that kept goods moving. The Strait of Malacca marked a critical transition point. This narrow passage between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra was unavoidable for ships traveling between the South China Sea and Indian Ocean. In some places, the strait narrowed to just a few miles. Ship captains had no choice but to pass through, and everyone knew it, from merchants to pirates to local rulers who controlled strategic points along the passage. Local rulers understood the value of controlling choke points. They could charge passage fees, offer protection services, or withhold them, provide pilots through tricky passages, and generally extract revenue from the maritime traffic that had nowhere else to go. This wasn't extortion in any simple sense. It was the medieval equivalent of charging tolls on a vital highway. And smart rulers kept fees reasonable enough that merchants paid rather than attempting to fight or find alternative routes. The entire passage from Canton to the Strait of Malacca could take anywhere from 2 weeks to over a month, depending on winds, weather, stops along the way, and whether you encountered any serious problems. For a modern cargo ship, the trip takes days. For an ancient merchant vessel, it was a major undertaking requiring skill, luck, and careful planning. And that was just the first leg of the journey. We haven't even reached the Indian Ocean yet, where the real distances begin. Those who have sailed difficult waters understand that successful navigation isn't about heroic moments. It's about competent seamanship, attention to detail, maintenance of equipment, and the accumulated experience of thousands of previous voyages distilled into practical knowledge. The mariners who made this journey weren't adventurers seeking glory. They were professionals doing a difficult, dangerous job for profit. And they did it well enough that the system functioned for centuries. Malacca, the inevitable stop. Emerge from the Strait of Malacca and you'd almost certainly stop at the city that gave the strait its name. Malacca, perched on the Malay Peninsula's west coast, occupied perhaps the single most strategic location in the entire Maritime Silk Road network. Every ship passing between the South China Sea and Indian Ocean came within sight of Malacca. Most stopped there. The smart ones did anyway. Why was Malacca inevitable? Geography, plain and simple. The city sat right at the narrowest, most navigable part of the strait. Ships needed fresh water. They needed to repair storm damage. They needed to trade for provisions. They needed information about conditions ahead, pirates, weather, political situations. Malacca provided all of this, and the local rulers understood perfectly well that geography had handed them a gold mine. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Malacca had transformed from a minor fishing village into one of Asia's great port cities. The transformation wasn't accidental. Local rulers actively courted trade, keeping tariffs reasonable, maintaining order in the harbor, and providing warehouses and commercial facilities. They understood that their wealth came from the ships that stopped there, and they treated merchants accordingly, firmly in matters of law and customs, but fairly enough that merchants kept returning. The population was cosmopolitan in the truest sense. Chinese merchants maintained permanent factories, the medieval term for trading posts. Arab and Indian traders had established communities. Local Malays formed the majority but shared the city with Javanese, Sumatrans, Burmese, Thais, and merchants from ports most people had never heard of. Languages mixed freely. The merchant class developed a commercial lingua franca that borrowed from Chinese, Malay, Arabic, and Tamil. Malacca's warehouses stored goods from across the known world. Chinese silk and porcelain awaited ships heading west. Indian cotton and spices waited for transport eastward. Southeast Asian products, precious woods, aromatic resins, tin from local mines, accumulated for shipment in all directions. The city was a sorting facility for global trade, where goods were repackaged, redistributed, and sent on to their final destinations. The religious complexity reflected the commercial mix. Buddhist temples served Chinese and Southeast Asian merchants. Mosques catered to Muslim traders from Arabia, Persia, India, and increasingly from the local population as Islam spread throughout the region. Hindu temples served Indian merchants. Even a few Nestorian Christians from Central Asia maintained a small community. Religious tolerance wasn't ideological, it was practical. You don't make money by alienating your customers on doctrinal grounds. Local industries developed to serve the maritime trade. Shipwrights repaired vessels and sometimes built new ones. Rope makers and sail makers found steady business. Food suppliers provisioned ships. Taverns and lodging houses served sailors and merchants. Interpreters and money changers worked the docks. The whole city essentially existed to facilitate maritime commerce, and it was very good at it. Those who remember international ports from their Navy days, places like Singapore or Hong Kong, that was Malacca 600 years earlier, minus the diesel and steel. Same basic function, a place where goods and people from different parts of the world converged, exchanged, and dispersed. Same cosmopolitan mix. Same focus on commerce above almost everything else. The local ruler, eventually styled as the Sultan of Malacca, grew wealthy from customs duties, fees, and direct participation in trade. The Sultanate's prosperity attracted attention from regional powers. Various kingdoms and empires eyed Malacca with mixture of admiration and envy. But the city's strength lay not in military power. It never had a particularly strong army or navy, but in its indispensability. Attack Malacca and you disrupted trade that benefited everyone. Better to use it, profit from it, and let it continue functioning. Malacca's importance eventually drew European attention. When Portuguese fleets reached the Indian Ocean in the early 16th century, Malacca was among their first major targets. They understood strategic geography as well as anyone. Control Malacca and you controlled passage between the Indian Ocean and South China Sea. In 1511, Portuguese forces captured the city, beginning European colonial presence in Southeast Asia that would last centuries. But in the centuries before that, Malacca was Southeast Asia's crown jewel, a city that prospered through geography, shrewd governance, and its role as the indispensable link in the Maritime Silk Road. Ships from Canton bound for India stopped there. Ships from India and beyond stopped there before continuing to China. It was unavoidable, essential, and enormously profitable. For a merchant making the full journey from China to the Middle East or vice versa, Malacca was where the first leg ended and the second began. You'd arrived from Chinese waters and now faced the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean. Different conditions, different navigational challenges, different commercial networks. Malacca was the transition point, the place where Eastern and Western maritime systems met and exchanged not just goods, but information, navigational knowledge, and commercial intelligence. And if you think modern shipping relies on strategic chokepoints, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, various straits and passages, understand that medieval merchants faced the same geographical realities. Malacca was their Suez, their Panama, their essential passage. Control it and you influence trade across half the world. Lose access to it and your commercial prospects dimmed considerably. Geography hasn't changed. We've just gotten faster at navigating it. Into the Bay of Bengal, where currents conspire. From Malacca, ships bound for India's west coast or beyond faced approximately 1,500 miles of open ocean crossing the Bay of Bengal. This wasn't coastal sailing where you could see land and duck into harbors if conditions deteriorated. This was blue water navigation where skill and experience meant the difference between arrival and disappearance without trace. The Bay of Bengal had earned its reputation among mariners. The same monsoon winds that powered trade also created conditions that could destroy ships. During monsoon transitions, those periods when the wind shifted from one direction to another, conditions could become treacherous. The bay could go from relatively calm to dangerous in hours as weather systems clashed. Experienced captains understood the seasonal patterns. The southwest monsoon, blowing from roughly April to October, allowed ships to sail from Malacca to India's eastern coast and then along to the western ports. The northeast monsoon, November to March, provided the return wind. But timing was critical. Leave too early and you might hit violent transition weather. Leave too late and you'd miss the best winds, forcing slower passage or even requiring you to wait months for the next seasonal shift. Navigation across open ocean required different skills than coastal sailing. Dead reckoning became essential, estimating speed, maintaining course, calculating distance traveled. Mariners developed various methods for estimating ship speed. One common technique involved dropping a piece of wood over the bow and timing how long it took to pass the stern, then using experience to convert this into approximate speed. Rough, but better than nothing. Course maintenance without visible landmarks required constant attention to sun position during day and stars at night. Arab navigators, particularly, excelled at celestial navigation. They could identify dozens of stars and knew their rising and setting positions at different latitudes. An experienced navigator could estimate his latitude within 50 miles or so using star altitudes measured with simple instruments. For longitude, much trickier. They relied on dead reckoning and characteristic features like water color, depth, and the presence of certain fish or birds that indicated proximity to land. Storms were a constant concern. The Bay of Bengal was prone to tropical cyclones, particularly from April to December. These weren't like the typhoons of the South China Sea, they were arguably worse. Bay of Bengal cyclones could be catastrophic, generating waves tall enough to swamp even large vessels and winds that could shred sails and snap masts like twigs. Ships caught in such storms had limited options. You couldn't outrun them. You couldn't really hide from them in open ocean. Your best bet was to reduce sail, secure everything possible, and try to ride it out. Crew members would lash themselves to fixed points to avoid being washed overboard. Everything not secured would be stowed below or tied down. Then you'd face hours, sometimes days, of fighting to keep your ship afloat while the ocean did its best to destroy you. Those who have been through serious weather at sea understand the fatigue. Not just physical exhaustion, though that's real enough. The mental strain of constant vigilance, of never being able to relax because the next wave might be the one that swamps your vessel, of knowing that one mistake, one line parting, one moment of inattention, could mean death for everyone aboard. Ancient mariners faced this without weather radar, without radio contact with shore, without any prospect of rescue if things went wrong. You survived or you didn't, and the ocean wasn't interested in your survival either way. But most crossings were routine if tedious. Days of steady sailing with consistent winds, crews settling into shipboard routine. Maintenance continued constantly. Rigging needed inspection and repair. Sails required patching. Pumps had to be manned regularly to remove water that inevitably leaked in. Crews lived on preserved food, mostly rice or grain, dried fish or meat, and whatever they could catch from the ocean. Water was rationed carefully. Everything tasted of salt eventually. Entertainment was limited. Crews would tell stories, sing work songs, gamble, though captains often prohibited this to prevent conflicts, and spend endless hours just watching the ocean. The tedium was broken only by work requirements and the occasional excitement of spotting other ships, marine life, or birds that might indicate land ahead. The psychological challenge of open ocean sailing shouldn't be minimized. Days or weeks with nothing but water in all directions, not knowing precisely where you were, unable to verify that your navigation was accurate until you made landfall, hoping you hadn't drifted too far off course. Modern sailors have GPS giving constant position updates, satellite weather forecasts, and radio communications. Ancient mariners had skill, experience, and faith in their calculations. That took a particular kind of mental fortitude. Landfall on India's eastern coast, ports like Nagapattinam or Masuliputtnam, meant the immediate crisis was over. You'd cross the bay successfully, a genuine accomplishment. Ships would put in for water, repairs, and usually some trading. But for vessels bound for India's western ports, the Malabar coast, where the real spice trade flourished, the journey continued. You'd work your way down India's eastern coast, round the southern tip at Cape Comorin, and then up the western coast to the great spice ports. The Bay of Bengal crossing was the sort of undertaking that sorted professional mariners from amateurs. Amateurs never made it. Professionals survived through skill, preparation, and respect for the ocean's power. It wasn't the longest leg of the Maritime Silk Road, and it wasn't the most dangerous in terms of piracy or political instability. But it was perhaps the most demanding in terms of pure seamanship. Open ocean doesn't forgive mistakes, and the Bay of Bengal was unforgiving even by oceanic standards. The Malabar coast, where pepper was worth gold. Round the southern tip of India and work your way up the western coast, and you'd reach the Malabar coast, that roughly 350-mile stretch of southwest India that was, for centuries, the center of the global spice trade. This was where the black pepper grew, along with cardamom, ginger, cinnamon, and various other spices that commanded astronomical prices in markets from China to Europe. Calicut, known locally as Kozhikode, was the crown jewel of the Malabar coast. By the 13th and 14th centuries, it had become one of the Indian Ocean's most important ports, rivaling even Canton and Malacca in commercial significance. The local ruler, the Zamorin, understood the value of trade and actively promoted it through favorable policies, religious tolerance, and investment in harbor infrastructure. What made the Malabar coast so valuable? Pepper. Specifically, black pepper, which grew prolifically in the western Ghats Mountains inland from the coast. In medieval markets, pepper was worth more than its weight in silver. In some transactions, it literally served as currency. The phrase peppercorn rent, meaning a nominal, trivial payment, would have seemed absurd to medieval merchants for whom pepper was as valuable as precious metals. Why was pepper so valuable? Partly because it genuinely improved food in an era before refrigeration. Pepper masked the flavor of meat that was starting to turn and added flavor to preserved foods. But more importantly, pepper was rare outside India. You couldn't grow it in China, Arabia, or Europe. The Malabar coast had a near monopoly on production, and monopolies are where fortunes are made. The economic structure was sophisticated. Pepper didn't grow at the coast. It grew in plantations inland in the mountains, tended by local farmers. Merchants purchased pepper from producers or middlemen, transported it to coastal warehouses, and then sold it to foreign traders. This multi-layer system meant profits were distributed among various parties, but the overall trade volume was so large that everyone involved could prosper. Foreign merchants established permanent communities in Malabar ports. Chinese traders had their own quarter in Calicut, complete with warehouses, living quarters, and temples. Arab and Persian merchants had similarly established communities, mosques, and commercial infrastructure. Indian merchants from other regions maintained offices. Jewish traders from the Middle East had been in Kerala for centuries, leaving inscriptions and artifacts documenting their presence. The Zamorin maintained order through a combination of local authority and respect for foreign merchant communities' autonomy. Foreign traders lived under their own community leaders, operated by their own commercial customs, and had considerable freedom in managing their affairs. As long as they paid customs duties and obeyed local law, they could worship as they pleased, organize themselves as they wished, and conduct business according to their traditional practices. This pragmatic tolerance wasn't ideological, it was economic. The Zamorin understood that his prosperity depended on attracting foreign trade. Harass merchants or impose excessive restrictions, and they'd take their business to competing ports like Quilon or Canton further down the coast. Keep conditions favorable, and Calicut became the preferred destination for traders from across the Indian Ocean. Those who remember international business from earlier decades will recognize this pattern. Countries that wanted foreign investment learned to create favorable conditions. The Zamorin was practicing this principle 6 centuries before it became standard economic development policy. He was, in modern terms, competing for market share through superior business environment. The volume of trade was substantial. Chroniclers from the period report hundreds of ships visiting Calicut annually. At peak seasons, you'd find vessels from China, Southeast Asia, Arabia, Persia, East Africa, and all around the Indian Ocean. The harbor would be so crowded that ships had to anchor in open roadstead, using smaller boats to ferry goods and people to shore. Pepper wasn't the only export. Kerala produced cardamom, ginger, cinnamon, though Ceylon had the finest quality, turmeric, and various other spices. The region also produced fine cotton textiles, metalwork, and coconut products. But pepper was king, the product that drew merchants from thousands of miles away and generated the wealth that built temples, endowed schools, and funded the Zamorin's court. Return cargoes varied by the merchant's origin. Chinese traders brought silk, porcelain, and metalwork. Arab merchants arrived with horses. Indian kingdoms paid premium prices for Arabian horses, which didn't breed well in tropical climate and had to be imported continuously. Persian traders brought dried fruits, nuts, and crafted goods. African merchants brought ivory, gold dust, and frankincense. The exchange was multilateral, complex, and enormously profitable for everyone involved. The Malabar coast wasn't without competition. Ceylon, Sri Lanka produced cinnamon and other goods. The Coromandel coast on India's eastern shore had its own trade networks. Indonesian islands produced nutmeg and cloves, but the Malabar coast's combination of pepper production, favorable geographic position on monsoon routes, and ruler-supported commercial infrastructure made it the logical choice for merchants looking to maximize profits while minimizing risks. Pirates were less of a problem here than in some other regions, partly because local powers maintained at least token naval forces, and partly because the concentration of trade made outright piracy more difficult. Attack a merchant ship near Calicut, and you'd have dozens of witnesses and likely pursuit. Safer to operate in more remote waters where you wouldn't be immediately caught. The Europeans' eventual arrival fundamentally disrupted this system. When Portuguese fleets reached Calicut in 1498, they didn't come looking for trade partnerships. They came to establish monopolies through force. Within a few decades, Portuguese naval power and willingness to use violence had severely disrupted the peaceful, prosperous trade networks that had operated for centuries. But that's another story, well beyond our period of focus. For now, in the 12th through 14th centuries, the Malabar coast represented the Maritime Silk Road at its best: peaceful, profitable, cosmopolitan, sophisticated. Ships from across the Indian Ocean converged on these ports, exchanged goods that were valuable precisely because they came from distant places, and then dispersed to their home ports carrying products that would sell for handsome profits. The Zamorin grew wealthy, merchants grew wealthy, pepper farmers grew relatively prosperous, and the system sustained itself generation after generation. When you think about global trade, this is the model. Find products that are valuable in distant markets, establish reliable transportation, create commercial infrastructure that facilitates exchange, maintain conditions favorable to merchants, and let human self-interest drive the system. The Malabar coast didn't invent this model. Similar principles operated in Malacca, Canton, and ports across the Indian Ocean, but it perfected the execution. And that's why, even today, Kerala's economy still revolves partly around spice production and export. Some things change slowly, if at all. Ceylon, the pearl between two seas. From the Malabar coast, ships bound further west would often stop at Ceylon, the island we now call Sri Lanka, sitting just off India's southern tip like a teardrop fallen from the subcontinent. Ceylon occupied a unique position in the Maritime Silk Road network, serving as both destination and waypoint, marketplace and harbor of refuge. The island had resources that commanded premium prices. Cinnamon grew wild in Ceylon's forests and was cultivated in plantations, producing what connoisseurs considered the world's finest quality. Ceylon's cinnamon was more aromatic, more flavorful, less bitter than varieties grown elsewhere. A merchant could purchase cinnamon in Ceylon and sell it in China, Arabia, or eventually Europe for substantial profit. But cinnamon wasn't Ceylon's only attraction. The island produced precious stones, rubies, sapphires, cat's eyes, tourmalines, and other gems that adorned the wealthy across Asia and beyond. Pearls came from the waters around Ceylon, particularly from the Gulf of Mannar between Ceylon and the Indian mainland. These weren't cultured pearls produced on demand. These were wild pearls, harvested by divers who risked their lives descending without breathing apparatus to collect oysters that might, if you were lucky, contain valuable pearls. Ceylon's ports, Colombo, Gala, and others, served as natural stopping points for ships crossing between the western Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal. The island's position meant that many ships passed nearby even if Ceylon wasn't their primary destination. Smart captains would stop for water, provisions, and to check if profitable trading opportunities existed. Often they did. The population was diverse, including Sinhalese majority, Tamil communities with close ties to southern India, and resident foreign merchant colonies. Buddhist monasteries dominated the religious landscape. Ceylon was and remains a center of Theravada Buddhism. These monasteries weren't just religious institutions. They were landowners, educators, and economic entities that participated in trade, particularly in products like cinnamon from lands they controlled. Those who have visited tropical islands understand the particular character they develop, isolated enough to maintain distinctive culture, but connected enough to external trade to remain prosperous and cosmopolitan. Ceylon balanced these tensions successfully. The island maintained its cultural identity while welcoming foreign merchants and adopting useful technologies and practices from abroad. Pearl diving was particularly dangerous work. Divers would descend 40, 50, sometimes 60 feet or more without breathing apparatus, relying on trained lung capacity and experience. They'd quickly harvest as many oysters as possible, then surface before oxygen ran out. Deaths weren't uncommon, from drowning, from pressure-related injuries, from sharks attracted by the disturbance. The divers were skilled professionals trained from youth, respected for their courage but poorly paid relative to the value of what they harvested. Ceylon also served as an information hub. Because so many ships stopped there, news from across the Indian Ocean converged in Ceylon's ports. Merchants would exchange not just goods but information, where pirates were operating, which ports had favorable conditions, what prices prevailed in distant markets, political changes that might affect trade routes. This information was nearly as valuable as the cargo in a ship's hold. A merchant who knew market conditions could time his purchases and sales to maximize profit. One who was uninformed would struggle to compete. The island's agriculture supported substantial population. Rice paddies occupied much of the flat coastal plain. Coconut palms provided food, oil, fiber, and timber. Fishing supplied protein. The interior mountains where cinnamon grew wild were also suitable for tea cultivation, though that would come later. The island was essentially self-sufficient in food, meaning it could support large-scale export industries without suffering local shortages. Chinese merchants were particularly active in Ceylon. Chinese records document extensive trade with the island, and archaeological evidence confirms Chinese ceramics and other goods reached Ceylon in quantity. Chinese emperors occasionally sent official missions to Ceylon, combining diplomatic purposes with commercial opportunities. The relationship was mutually beneficial. China wanted Ceylon's cinnamon, gems, and unique products, while Ceylon merchants eagerly purchased Chinese silk and porcelain. Arab geographers wrote extensively about Ceylon, describing its ports, products, and strategic position. They understood the island's importance in the broader maritime network. Some Arab merchants settled permanently in Ceylon, establishing families that persisted for generations. The interaction between Buddhist Sinhalese, Hindu Tamils, and Muslim Arabs created interesting cultural hybridizations, visible in everything from architecture to cuisine to language borrowing. Ceylon's independence was somewhat precarious. Powerful kingdoms on the Indian mainland could have conquered the island if they'd been determined to do so. But the same factors that made Ceylon valuable as a trading port, its island position, its non-threatening nature, also protected it. Conquer Ceylon and you'd have to administer it, defend it against other powers, and potentially disrupt the trade that made it valuable. Easier to trade with Ceylon than try to own it. The island's culture reflected its maritime connections. Sinhalese literature and art showed influences from India, Southeast Asia, and even China. Buddhist practices incorporated elements from various Theravada traditions. Architecture combined local styles with techniques and aesthetics borrowed from abroad. This wasn't cultural confusion. It was cosmopolitan sophistication. the natural result of centuries of peaceful commercial exchange with diverse trading partners. For a merchant captain making the passage from the Malabar coast toward Arabia and the Red Sea, Ceylon was often the last substantial landfall before striking out across the Arabian Sea, another long stretch of open water. Ships would provision carefully, taking on fresh water, food, and any last supplies needed. They'd check the ship carefully for maintenance issues that needed addressing before facing extended ocean passage. And they'd gather intelligence about conditions ahead, monsoon timing, piracy reports, political situations in distant ports. Ceylon existed because geography placed it where it was, a fortunate accident of plate tectonics that left an island sitting astride one of the world's most important maritime routes. But Ceylon prospered because its inhabitants understood how to leverage that geographic advantage, producing valuable products, maintaining ports and commercial infrastructure, treating foreign merchants fairly, and creating a reputation as a place where business could be conducted efficiently and honestly. Geography provides opportunity. Human decisions determine whether that opportunity is seized or squandered. Ceylon seized it successfully for centuries. Across the Arabian Sea, the final ocean, from Ceylon westward meant crossing the Arabian Sea, roughly 1,400 miles of open ocean separating India from the Arabian Peninsula. This was the route that connected the eastern Indian Ocean world with the Middle East, eventually reaching the Mediterranean and Europe beyond. It was also one of the most reliable crossings, thanks to those predictable monsoon winds. The southwest monsoon, blowing from April through October, pushed ships westward from India to Arabia with remarkable consistency. Experienced captains could count on it. They'd leave Indian ports in May or June, ride the monsoon westward, and arrive in Arabian ports or the Red Sea entrance by late summer. Then they'd wait for the northeast monsoon to reverse in November, providing the wind home. The system was so reliable that merchants could make contracts years in advance, knowing with reasonable certainty when their ships would arrive. But predictable doesn't mean safe. The Arabian Sea could turn violent. Cyclones occurred, though less frequently than in the Bay of Bengal. More common were strong winds during monsoon peak that could stress rigging and sails beyond their limits. A sudden gust could snap a mast or shred canvas that was already worn from previous use. And always there was the danger of navigational error. Miss your landfall, and you might sail past your destination into unknown waters with dwindling supplies. Water management was critical on these long crossings. A ship departing India with 50 crew and passengers might need 500 gallons of fresh water or more for the voyage, assuming favorable winds and direct passage. That's weight, taking up hold space that could otherwise carry profitable cargo. Water casks were carefully maintained, checked regularly for leaks, and consumption was strictly monitored. Run out of water mid-ocean, and you faced a crisis that could turn deadly very quickly. Food was simpler to manage because preserved foods could last months if kept dry. Rice, dried fish, dried meat, ship's biscuit, hard, dry, nutritious if not particularly appealing. Crews ate monotonous diets but adequate ones. The officers and passengers might have slightly better fare, some dried fruits, honey, spices to improve flavor. But everyone understood that ocean crossings meant plain food and careful rationing. Navigation across the Arabian Sea followed similar principles to other ocean crossings. During the day, mariners used sun position and estimated speed to maintain course. At night, stars provided guidance. The North Star, Polaris, was particularly important for latitude determination. Arab navigators were masters at this, developing sophisticated techniques for using star observations to calculate position. The camel, that simple wooden board with a knotted string, allowed remarkably accurate latitude measurements. An experienced navigator could determine his latitude within 20 or 30 miles using star observations and this basic tool. Longitude remained problematic. You needed accurate timekeeping for that, which wouldn't exist until centuries later. So longitude was estimated through dead reckoning, accounting for speed and course over time. It was imprecise, but combined with other observations, usually sufficient. Those who have navigated by traditional methods, and some of you who served in the Navy may have trained on celestial navigation even if you never used it operationally, understand the skill required. You're not just identifying stars. You're measuring their altitude above the horizon accurately, compensating for various factors that affect observations, and then calculating position from these measurements. Do this successfully night after night across a week or more of ocean passage, and you demonstrate genuine professional competence. Shipping traffic increased as you approached the Arabian coast. The Arabian Sea was an empty ocean. It was a maritime highway with traffic moving in both directions. Ships outbound from Arabia heading to India, ships returning to Arabia from eastern voyages, coastal traders working between Arabian ports, fishing vessels operating from coastal villages. As you neared land, you'd start seeing other vessels with increasing frequency, a reassuring sign that landfall approached. First signs of land weren't always visual. Experienced mariners learned to read subtle indicators, changes in water color suggesting shallower depths, particular types of seaweed or floating debris, birds that roosted on land but flew out to sea to feed, cloud formations that formed over land but not open ocean, the smell of land itself, vegetation, smoke from fires, earth, carried on the wind before the coast became visible on the horizon. Making landfall on the Arabian coast was its own challenge. The coastline wasn't uniformly hospitable. Long stretches were barren, offering no shelter or water. You needed to make landfall at specific locations where good harbors existed. Miss your target port and you might face another 50 or 100 miles of coastal sailing before finding suitable anchorage. And coastal sailing had its own dangers: shoals, reefs, and tricky currents that could put an inattentive ship on the rocks. The Arabian coast was harsh geography. This wasn't lush India or tropical Southeast Asia. This was desert meeting ocean, with only occasional spots where wadis, seasonal rivers, reached the coast and permitted permanent settlement. Water was the limiting factor for everything. Ports existed where fresh water was available, not necessarily where geography otherwise favored harbors. This meant some Arabian ports were actually quite exposed, protected more by seasonal wind patterns than by natural breakwaters or protected bays. But what the Arabian coast lacked in natural abundance, it made up for in strategic position. Arabia sat between India and the Mediterranean, between the Indian Ocean and Europe. Every ship carrying goods from the east toward Europe or the Middle East had to pass along or near the Arabian coast. This geographic reality made Arabian ports wealthy despite their harsh surroundings. The crossing itself, if conditions were favorable, might take 2 weeks to a month depending on exact departure and arrival points and how directly you could sail. With unfavorable conditions, weak winds, contrary currents, navigational errors, it could take considerably longer. Ships carried enough supplies for extended passages, understanding that optimistic voyage estimates rarely matched reality. Better to arrive with supplies remaining than run short and face potential crisis. Those who served aboard ships understand that ocean passages are mostly routine, punctuated by occasional crises. Hours and days of normal operations, interrupted by equipment failure, weather challenges, or navigational problems requiring immediate attention and skillful response. Ancient mariners faced the same rhythm, just without the technological backup that modern ships take for granted. When something went wrong at sea, You fixed it yourself with what you had aboard, or you lived with the consequences. There was no radio for help, no rescue helicopters, no satellite emergency beacons. Self-reliance wasn't a philosophy, it was necessity. Aden, guardian of the Red Sea. The name meant everything to mariners working the western Indian Ocean. Located at the southwestern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, Aden guarded the entrance to the Red Sea like a fortress guarding a mountain pass. Every ship bound for Egypt and the Mediterranean, every vessel carrying goods from India or beyond toward European markets, every merchant hoping to tap into the lucrative trade with Christian kingdoms and Muslim caliphates, they all stopped at Aden. They had no choice. The city sat in the crater of an extinct volcano, one of the most dramatic harbor settings in the world. Those volcanic mountains provided natural protection from weather and made military attack extremely difficult. The harbor itself was excellent, deep water, good holding ground for anchors, and sheltered from the worst weather. But what made Aden truly essential was its position. It sat exactly where the Arabian Sea met the Red Sea entrance, where the monsoon winds that powered Indian Ocean trade encountered the different wind patterns of the Red Sea itself. Aden was ruled by various dynasties over the centuries, but all understood the same basic principle. Control Aden and you tax the lucrative trade between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. They charged customs duties on both goods entering and leaving, collected harbor fees from ships that anchored, and taxed the warehouses and markets where goods were stored and sold. The revenue was substantial enough to support a significant military force and impressive civic infrastructure despite the challenging environment. Water was Aden's critical challenge. The area received almost no rainfall. What little precipitation occurred ran off the volcanic mountains in brief, violent floods. The solution was engineering. Massive cisterns carved into rock to catch and store every drop of water that fell. These cisterns, some of them ancient even in medieval times, held enough water to supply the city's population and the ships that stopped there. Managing water meant managing Aden's survival and prosperity. The population reflected the city's commercial role. Arab majority, but with established communities of Indian merchants, Persian traders, Jewish merchants who worked the Red Sea routes, Egyptian factors representing Alexandria-based houses, and occasional representatives from Christian kingdoms looking to trade with the Muslim world. The mix was cosmopolitan, multilingual, and focused entirely on commerce. Goods arriving from India and beyond would be offloaded at Aden, warehoused temporarily, and then transferred to vessels suitable for Red Sea navigation. The Red Sea required different ships than open ocean passages. It was narrower, with different wind patterns, numerous reefs and shoals, and political complications as you navigated past various kingdoms and sultanates that controlled different sections of coastline. Ships specialized for Red Sea trade were typically smaller than ocean-going vessels, more maneuverable, and operated by crews with intimate knowledge of Red Sea navigation challenges. Those who remember transiting the Suez Canal, and some of you who served in the Navy certainly did, understand that different waterways require different navigation approaches. The Red Sea in medieval times was even more challenging than today because there were no accurate charts, no navigation lights, no regular naval patrols ensuring safe passage. You relied on experienced pilots who knew the waters and could guide you through safely. These pilots were valuable specialists, and smart merchants paid their fees without complaint. Aden also served as an intelligence center. Merchants exchanged information about markets, prices, conditions in distant ports, political developments that might affect trade, and piracy threats. A merchant arriving from India could learn what prices Egyptian markets were paying for pepper or cinnamon. allowing him to decide whether continuing to Egypt made economic sense or whether selling at Aden might be more profitable. This information flow was essential to commercial success. The city's warehouses were substantial structures, built to protect valuable goods from heat, theft, and the occasional rain. They were organized by product type, separate facilities for spices, textiles, metals, ceramics. Security was taken seriously. Valuable cargo attracted thieves, and warehouse operators maintained guards and careful inventory systems. Merchants could rent space by volume or weight, store their goods, and retrieve them when ready to move them onward. Aden's fortifications were impressive. Those volcanic mountains provided natural defense, but the city also built walls, towers, and gates to control access. This wasn't paranoia, it was prudence. A city sitting on massive quantities of valuable trade goods needed defenses against pirates, raiders, and ambitious regional powers. The fortifications served their purpose through various political upheavals, though eventually artillery made medieval walls obsolete everywhere. The departure of ships for the Red Sea was a significant event. Merchants would gather their goods from warehouses, arrange for transport, negotiate with ship captains, and ensure all customs formalities were completed. Ships bound for Egypt would load carefully, balancing cargo for stability in the confined waters ahead. Departure usually coincided with favorable wind patterns. There was no point fighting against wind and current when patience would eventually bring favorable conditions. For merchants, Aden represented a decision point. Continue northward toward Egypt and eventually Europe, or take goods westward along the southern Arabian coast toward the Persian Gulf and Mesopotamian markets, or even back eastward, having acquired Western goods that would sell well in India or beyond. The flexibility of the maritime network meant merchants could adjust plans based on current market conditions, rather than being locked into predetermined routes. Aden wasn't beautiful in any conventional sense. It was harsh, austere, functional. The volcanic landscape was dramatic but barren. Water was scarce and precious. The heat was intense most of the year, but it was wealthy, strategic, and essential. Those who controlled Aden controlled access to markets worth fortunes. That strategic value made up for every hardship the environment imposed. The city survived for centuries on its geographic advantage. Even when political control changed, and it changed regularly as different dynasties and empires rose and fell, Aden continued functioning because its role in the maritime network was too important to disrupt. Conquerors understood that Aden's value came from facilitating trade, not from trying to monopolize or restrict it. Keep trade flowing and tax it. That was Aden's formula, and it worked remarkably well. When the Portuguese arrived in the Indian Ocean in the 16th century, they attempted to control or bypass Aden, establishing their own bases and trying to redirect trade through routes they controlled. They were only partially successful. Aden's geographic position remained as relevant as ever, and eventually, trade patterns reasserted themselves. Geography doesn't change just because new powers arrive with new ambitions. The Red Sea Passage, navigating frustration. Roughly 1,200 miles of confined water separating Africa from Arabia, connecting the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. On maps it looks straightforward, a long, relatively straight passage pointing northwest. In reality, it was one of the most challenging and frustrating waterways in the medieval maritime world. Mariners who'd successfully crossed thousands of miles of open ocean would face genuine difficulty navigating this narrow sea. The problem started with winds. The Red Sea didn't benefit from the regular monsoon system that made Indian Ocean navigation relatively predictable. Instead, winds were variable, often contrary to your desired direction, and prone to sudden changes. Compounding this, the sea was narrow enough that wind funneling between the mountain ranges on both sides created unusual patterns. You might have favorable wind 1 hour and find it shifting against you the next. The confined nature of the passage meant you couldn't simply wait for favorable winds and make a straight run. You were constantly tacking, working your way against contrary winds, hugging coastlines to take advantage of local wind patterns, and generally spending far more time and effort covering each mile than you would in open ocean. A passage that should take a week or two might stretch to a month or more depending on conditions. Reefs were another nightmare. The Red Sea is full of coral reefs, many of them poorly charted or completely unknown to mariners unfamiliar with local waters. Run onto a reef and you face potential shipwreck far from any assistance. The water's clarity, beautiful to modern divers, meant you could sometimes see reefs below, but this required constant vigilance and good light conditions. At night or in rough weather, reefs became invisible death traps. This is where local pilots became absolutely essential. Pilots who'd spent years learning the Red Sea's reef systems, wind patterns, and navigation hazards charged substantial fees for their services. Merchants paid without complaint because the alternative, attempting navigation without expert guidance, was foolish in the extreme. These pilots knew where channels existed through reef systems, which coastal anchorages offered protection from different wind directions, and where fresh water could be obtained at the infrequent oases. Political complications added another layer of difficulty. The Red Sea coastline was divided among various sultanates, kingdoms, and tribes, each with their own ideas about taxing passing ships. Some demanded payment for safe passage. Others provided services like pilots or water in exchange for fees. Pirates operated from hidden coves along the coast, preying on shipping. Coastal tribes sometimes attacked ships that were becalmed or had run aground, seeing them as legitimate salvage. The heat was oppressive, particularly in summer months. The Red Sea region is one of the hottest places on Earth. Temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees F, and on deck under the direct sun it felt far worse. Those who served in the Middle East or North Africa understand heat, but this was heat combined with humidity from the surrounding water and no escape. There was no air conditioning, no cold water, just hot air, hot water, hot everything. Crew members would work early morning and evening, resting in shade during the worst heat of midday. Fresh water management became even more critical than during ocean passages. The heat meant crew members needed more water, but opportunities to resupply were limited to scattered coastal settlements. Water rationing had to be strict, and any spoilage or leakage was a potential crisis. Some ships would stop every few days at known water sources, while others tried to carry enough for the entire passage to minimize delays and avoid paying inflated prices at coastal settlements. Those who remember desert service, and those who served in places like North Africa or the Middle East certainly do, understand that heat isn't just uncomfortable. It's dangerous. It saps strength, clouds judgment, and creates medical problems from dehydration to heat stroke. Ancient mariners faced this without the medical support, hydration protocols, or heat management equipment that modern military forces employ. They simply endured. The northern reaches of the Red Sea opened into the Gulf of Suez, pointing toward Egypt, or the Gulf of Aqaba, leading toward the Levant. Ships bound for Egypt would enter the Gulf of Suez and make their way to ports like Suez or Kulzum, where goods would be offloaded for overland transport to Cairo and Alexandria. The final maritime leg completed, merchants now faced desert again, but this time by land caravan, carrying goods the last 100 miles or so to reach the Mediterranean. The irony wasn't lost on experienced merchants. You'd sail thousands of miles from China or India, crossing multiple oceans successfully, only to spend weeks frustrated in the Red Sea struggling to make progress against contrary winds through reef-strewn waters. The Red Sea passage was often the most aggravating part of the entire journey, Not the most dangerous in terms of catastrophic storms, but certainly the most tedious and frustrating. Yet it was necessary. There was no practical alternative for moving bulk goods from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. The overland routes through Mesopotamia or Arabia were even more difficult and more limited in capacity. The Red Sea, for all its frustrations, was the best bad option available. So mariners endured it, complained about it extensively. We have written complaints from medieval merchants that sound remarkably like modern griping about difficult passages, and kept using it because profit justified hardship. Those who have worked in challenging environments understand that sometimes you face conditions you can't change and simply have to work through. The Red Sea was such an environment for medieval mariners. You accepted the contrary winds, the reefs, the heat, the political complications, and you navigated carefully, patiently, and with maximum attention to experienced pilots who knew what they were doing. And eventually, you'd emerge at the northern end, battered and frustrated but successful, ready for the final leg to Alexandria and the Mediterranean markets. Alexandria, where east met west. The name carried weight that transcended geography. Founded by Alexander the Great, developed by the Ptolemies, conquered by Rome, inherited by Islam, Alexandria had been a great city for over 1,000 years before our period begins. By the 12th and 13th centuries, it was the Mediterranean's premier port for Eastern trade, the place where goods from the Indian Ocean finally reached European markets. The city's position was strategic, sitting on Egypt's Mediterranean coast, connected by river and canal to the Nile, which itself connected to the Red Sea ports via overland caravan routes. Goods arriving at Suez or other Red Sea terminals would be transported overland to Cairo or directly to Alexandria, where they'd enter Mediterranean trade networks heading to Italy, Spain, France, and beyond. Alexandria's harbor was among the ancient world's engineering marvels. The famous lighthouse, the Pharos, one of the seven wonders, still stood, though damaged by earthquakes and showing its age. It no longer functioned as originally built, but it remained an impressive landmark visible from sea, guiding ships toward one of the Mediterranean's busiest ports. The harbor facilities had been maintained and expanded over centuries, capable of handling the enormous traffic that made Alexandria wealthy. The warehouses were massive, entire buildings devoted to storing pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and other spices. Separate facilities for textiles, Chinese silk, Indian cotton, Egyptian linen. Warehouses for ceramics, carefully packed to prevent breakage. Facilities for storing metals, dyes, medicinal substances, and the thousands of other products that flowed through the city. The logistics of managing this inventory, keeping records, preventing theft, ensuring proper storage conditions, required sophisticated systems and large staff. Alexandria's population reflected its commercial role. Egyptian majority, but with substantial communities of Italian merchants, particularly Venetians and Genoese who dominated Mediterranean trade. Byzantine Greeks maintained presence despite the political tensions between Muslim Egypt and Christian Constantinople. Jewish merchants worked throughout the Mediterranean trade network. Arab merchants connected Alexandria to the broader Islamic world. The mix was cosmopolitan in the extreme. The religious diversity was notable even by medieval standards. Mosques served the Muslim majority. Coptic Christian churches reflected Egypt's ancient Christian tradition. Orthodox churches served Greeks and other Eastern Christians. European merchants had their own churches. Jewish synagogues accommodated the substantial Jewish commercial community. This wasn't modern religious tolerance based on principle. It was pragmatic accommodation based on commercial necessity. You don't make money by excluding customers based on their worship practices. The financial systems were sophisticated. Letters of credit allowed merchants to conduct business without physically transporting large quantities of coins or precious metals. Banking houses facilitated currency exchange. You might arrive with silver dinars and need to pay in gold bezants. Insurance was available, sharing risk among multiple parties. Contract law, developed over centuries of Mediterranean trade, provided frameworks for resolving disputes between parties from different kingdoms speaking different languages. Those who worked in international business before modern telecommunications will recognize these systems. The fundamentals of trade finance, credit, currency exchange, insurance, contract law, existed in medieval form, adapted to the technologies and limitations of the era. The sophistication might seem surprising until you remember that humans have been trading long distance for millennia, and they'd figured out most of the essential solutions to recurring problems. Goods leaving Alexandria bound for Europe would typically transfer to Italian ships. Venetian and Genoese merchants dominated this trade, operating large galleys powered by both sail and oars. These galleys would transport Eastern goods to Italian ports, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, from which they'd be distributed throughout Europe. The profits were enormous. Spices purchased in Alexandria might sell in Paris or London for 3 or 4 times the price, sometimes more. Even accounting for transportation costs, insurance, taxes, and various fees, merchants could make fortunes. Alexandria also exported Egyptian products. Cotton was a major crop in the Nile Delta, and Egyptian cotton was renowned for its quality. Linen production was ancient in Egypt, and the textiles were valued throughout the Mediterranean. Sugar, a relatively new crop in the Middle East, was beginning to be cultivated in Egypt and exported. Alum, essential for textile dyeing, came from Egyptian sources. And of course, grain. Egypt had fed Rome for centuries, and it continued exporting wheat to grain-deficit regions. But Alexandria's greatest importance was as the gateway for Eastern goods. Without Alexandria, Europeans had no practical access to Indian spices, Chinese silks, or the countless other products that flowed along the Maritime Silk Road. The city sat at a critical bottleneck, and whoever controlled Alexandria controlled access to Eastern trade. This made Alexandria valuable beyond its own production. It was a choke point, a gateway, an indispensable link in global commerce. The Mamluks who ruled Egypt from the mid-13th century understood this perfectly. They maintained Alexandria's commercial infrastructure, kept harbor facilities in good condition, and while they taxed trade heavily, they didn't tax it so heavily that merchants would desperately seek alternatives. The revenue from Alexandria's trade financed the Mamluk state and its military forces. Those who understand strategic economics will immediately see the parallel to modern oil states or countries that control critical shipping passages. Alexandria's power came not from its own production, but from its position in a global network. Control the node where valuable trade flows concentrate, and you derive enormous revenue regardless of whether you produce anything locally. It's a pattern as old as trade itself. The city had problems too. Alexandria was densely populated, and sanitation was challenging. Fresh water came from the Nile via canal, but distribution wasn't always reliable. Fire was a constant threat in a city of wooden structures and warehouses full of flammable goods. Political instability occasionally disrupted trade when dynasties changed or external threats emerged. Epidemics swept through periodically. Crowded port cities were always vulnerable to disease. But these problems didn't seriously diminish Alexandria's commercial importance. Merchants needed access to Eastern goods, and Alexandria provided that access. The city's role was too important for temporary problems to derail permanently. Commerce always recovered, ships always returned, and the flow of goods continued. For a merchant captain who'd begun his journey in Canton months or even years before, Alexandria represented the end of the maritime phase. Goods would be transferred to European merchants, payments would be received, accounts would be settled. The captain might purchase European goods to carry back: metals, glass, wool, textiles, weapons, or he might simply take on ballast and return in hopes of securing Eastern goods for the return voyage. Alexandria was where East met West in the most literal sense, where products from China, India, Southeast Asia, and Arabia entered European markets. The city was a fulcrum point, a transfer station, and a profit center for everyone involved. Those goods that started their journey in Canton workshops or Kerala plantations would end up in Paris kitchens or London marketplaces, having passed through Alexandria on their long journey westward. And the profits from this trade built fortunes, financed kingdoms, and funded the infrastructure that sustained global commerce for centuries. Goods and their journeys. What moved and why? We've followed the routes, visited the ports, met the merchants and mariners. Now let's consider what actually moved along these sea lanes and why certain goods justified the expense, risk, and effort of transporting them thousands of miles. Silk heads the list for obvious reasons. Chinese silk was unique in the medieval world. No other civilization could produce it despite centuries of trying to steal the technology. The fabric was lightweight relative to its value, which made it economically viable for long-distance transport. It didn't spoil or degrade significantly during long voyages if kept dry, and demand was essentially unlimited across every society that encountered it. Silk moved from China to every corner of the trading world, and Chinese workshops worked continuously to meet demand. But silk wasn't uniform. There were dozens of grades and varieties. Raw silk in skeins for local weaving. Woven silk in plain, figured, and brocaded patterns. Embroidered silks showing extraordinary craftsmanship. Silk thread for use in luxury textiles elsewhere. Each variety had its own market and price point, from relatively affordable silk that middle-class merchants might purchase to extraordinary pieces that only royalty could afford. Porcelain was China's other unique export. The technology for producing true porcelain, that hard, translucent, resonant ceramic, was a Chinese secret for centuries. European potters could produce earthenware and stoneware, but not true porcelain. The material was brittle and required careful packing for transport, but it was valuable enough to justify the effort. Porcelain arrived in Middle Eastern and European markets as expensive luxury goods, used for display and special occasions rather than everyday purposes. Those who remember pre-plastic eras, when ceramic dishware was standard in homes, can imagine how remarkable fine porcelain seemed to people accustomed to rough pottery. The translucency when held to light, the clear ringing tone when struck, the smooth surface and perfect glaze, these qualities marked porcelain as obviously superior to anything produced locally. And if you broke a piece, you couldn't simply buy a replacement at the local shop. You needed to wait for the next shipment from China, which might be months or years away. Spices dominated the westbound trade from India and Southeast Asia. Black pepper, the most commercially important, was essentially a form of currency. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, mace, cardamom, ginger, each had its own characteristics and uses. Medieval Europeans used spices extensively, not just for food flavoring but for medicine, preservation, and status display. A merchant who could afford to serve heavily spiced food at his table was demonstrating wealth and sophistication. The modern question, why were spices so valuable when they're cheap today, has a straightforward answer: monopoly and scarcity. These spices grew only in limited regions. No amount of European demand could create supply outside those regions. Therefore, anyone who controlled supply or transport could charge premium prices, and they did. The profit margins were enormous, which justified the risks and costs of long-distance maritime trade. Cotton flowed from India westward. Indian cotton was finer than cotton grown elsewhere, and Indian dyers had mastered techniques for creating color-fast dyes that wouldn't fade with washing or sunlight. Cotton textiles were practical goods with broad markets. Everyone needed clothing, and Indian cotton was superior to local alternatives for those who could afford it. Precious stones moved in all directions, but particularly from India and Ceylon toward China, Middle East, and Europe. Rubies, sapphires, emeralds, diamonds. These portable concentrations of wealth were ideal for long-distance trade. Small, valuable, durable, universally appreciated. A merchant could carry a fortune in gems in a small pouch, reducing bulk and weight while maintaining value. Gems also served as wealth storage in an era before reliable banking systems. Metals traded extensively. Chinese iron and steel were excellent quality. Arab and Indian metalworkers produced superior tools, weapons, and decorative items. Tin from Southeast Asia was essential for bronze production. Copper from various sources supplied manufacturing everywhere. These bulk goods were heavy relative to value, so they typically moved as return cargo or when specific shortages made transport economical. Horses moved from Arabia to India. Indian climate didn't favor horse breeding, yet Indian kingdoms needed cavalry for military purposes. Arabian horses were hardy, relatively heat-tolerant, and suitable for Indian conditions. The trade was substantial, thousands of horses annually at peak periods. These weren't luxury goods. They were military necessities, and Indian rulers paid accordingly. Pearls from the Persian Gulf and Ceylon moved to all markets. The jewelry uses are obvious, but pearls also ground into powder for medicine in both Islamic and Chinese traditions. The best pearls commanded astronomical prices. Single perfect large pearls could equal a ship's value. Pearl fisheries were carefully controlled by whoever governed the waters where they occurred. Aromatic woods from Southeast Asia, sandalwood, aloe wood, camphor, served both practical and luxury purposes. These woods provided incense for religious ceremonies, perfumes, and medicinal preparations. They were light relative to value and traded in quantities from small personal purchases to bulk cargo. Textiles flowed in multiple directions. Chinese silk eastbound, Indian cotton westbound, wool textiles from Europe and Middle East, linen from Egypt. Each region produced textiles suited to local resources and techniques, and each found markets elsewhere where their particular qualities were valued. Dyes and dyestuffs were valuable commodities. Indigo for blue, madder for red, various substances for other colors. Creating color-fast dyes that wouldn't fade was technologically challenging, and regions that mastered particular colors could export their products or the raw dyestuffs. The bright colors visible in surviving medieval textiles weren't common. They represented expensive dyes and skilled application. Books and manuscripts moved in small numbers but high value. Islamic texts, Chinese classics, technical manuals on various subjects. The transmission of written knowledge along trade routes was significant despite low volumes. A single important manuscript might be copied dozens of times, spreading knowledge geographically as copies dispersed. Medical substances traded widely. Rare herbs, mineral compounds, animal products believed to have medicinal properties. The pharmacopoeia of each region included substances from distant sources. Chinese medicine used frankincense from Arabia. Islamic medicine incorporated substances from India and Southeast Asia. This medical trade wasn't trivial. It represented attempts to cure illness using the best knowledge available. Luxury goods of all types traded: carved jade, fine lacquerwork, ivory carvings, decorated weapons, musical instruments, rare woods for furniture, glassware, carpets. These goods served display and status purposes. A wealthy merchant or noble demonstrated status partly through possessing goods that obviously came from distant places and cost substantial sums. The goods themselves might have modest practical value, but their social signaling value was considerable. What didn't move? Bulk goods of low value. Grain typically moved only regionally. Timber was too heavy relative to value except for rare woods. Stone for construction didn't travel far. Common pottery was produced locally everywhere. Basic foodstuffs moved regionally but not intercontinentally. The fundamental economic principle was clear. For goods to justify long-distance transport, they had to have sufficient value-to-weight ratio that transport costs didn't exceed value. Those who have worked in logistics or shipping understand this immediately. You don't ship bricks from China to Europe because by the time you paid transport costs, the bricks would cost more than local production. But you do ship silk or spices because even after transport costs, profit margins remain substantial. Medieval merchants understood these economics instinctively, which is why certain goods dominated long-distance trade while others remained purely local. The Maritime Silk Road moved luxury goods, specialty products, things that were unique to specific regions or significantly better when produced in particular places. It moved portable wealth and status symbols. It moved technology in the form of finished goods even when the production techniques remained secret. And it moved enough of these goods, consistently enough, to generate the wealth that sustained the entire maritime network for centuries. The spread of ideas, more than just goods, but goods were never the only cargo. Ships carried ideas, technologies, religions, and knowledge that transformed civilizations far more profoundly than any quantity of silk or spices. The Maritime Silk Road was a transmission belt for human innovation and belief, and its impact on cultural history rivals its commercial importance. Buddhism spread along these sea routes from India to Southeast Asia, China, and beyond. The religion's transmission wasn't just scripture. It included art, architecture, philosophy, meditation techniques, and monastic organization. Buddhist monks traveled as passengers on merchant vessels, establishing monasteries in port cities, converting local populations, and creating networks that persisted for centuries. The distinctive Buddhist architecture visible across Asia today reflects transmission patterns that followed maritime trade routes. Islam's spread throughout the Indian Ocean world was partly maritime. Arab merchants brought their faith to trading posts from East Africa to Indonesia. They married local women, establishing Muslim families in distant ports. They built mosques that served as community centers. They demonstrated that commercial success and Islamic faith were compatible, an appealing message in commercially focused port cities. The result was voluntary conversion across vast regions, creating the Islamic societies that characterize much of the Indian Ocean littoral today. Christianity had smaller presence in Indian Ocean trade, but still traveled the routes. Nestorian Christians from the Middle East established communities in India and even reached China via both land and sea routes. These communities were small but persistent, maintaining contact with coreligionists thousands of miles away through the same maritime networks that moved commercial goods. Hinduism, already established in India, spread to Southeast Asia partly through maritime contact. Hindu merchants and rulers brought their religious practices to kingdoms in what's now Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Cambodia. The spectacular temple complexes like Angkor Wat testify to this transmission, showing Hindu architecture and iconography far from India, transported by traders and priests who followed maritime routes. Technology transfer was significant. Chinese innovations like the magnetic compass and stern rudder were adopted by Arab and Indian mariners. Chinese papermaking technology spread westward, eventually reaching Europe and revolutionizing record-keeping and literary production. Gunpowder, another Chinese innovation, followed trade routes westward with world-changing consequences. Shipbuilding techniques were shared and adapted. The best ideas tended to spread because they improved ship performance and safety. Agricultural products and cultivation techniques traveled these routes. New crops were introduced to regions where they'd never grown before. Sugar cultivation, originally from India and Southeast Asia, spread throughout the Indian Ocean world and eventually to the Mediterranean and Atlantic. Cotton cultivation expanded to new regions. Citrus fruits moved from Asia westward. Each successful agricultural transfer enriched the receiving region's food supply and economy. Culinary traditions mixed and merged. Spices from Southeast Asia transformed cuisine across Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. Cooking techniques traveled with the cooks, often servants or slaves accompanying wealthy merchants. New dishes emerged from this mixing, combining ingredients and methods from different traditions. The cosmopolitan cuisine of major port cities reflected their commercial connections. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge flowed along these routes. Arab mathematicians transmitted Indian number systems, including the critical concept of zero westward. Chinese astronomical observations reached Islamic scholars, who combined them with Greek and Persian knowledge. Navigational mathematics improved as mariners from different traditions shared techniques. The world's mathematical and scientific knowledge gradually consolidated as ideas circulated via maritime networks. Medical knowledge merged as practitioners encountered different traditions. Chinese medicine influenced Islamic medical practice. Indian Ayurvedic concepts spread to Southeast Asia. Each tradition had effective treatments for certain conditions, and sharing knowledge meant better outcomes for patients. The medical texts that survived from this period often show awareness of multiple medical traditions, suggesting active exchange of knowledge among practitioners. Languages borrowed extensively from each other. Arabic words entered Persian, Indian languages, and even Chinese in trading contexts. Chinese terms for specific goods or concepts entered other languages. Maritime vocabulary developed a kind of international common language, borrowing from Arabic, Persian, Malay, and Chinese sources. Modern languages in the Indian Ocean region still show evidence of this historical mixing. Art and artistic techniques traveled. Chinese ceramic influences appear in Middle Eastern pottery. Persian miniature painting influenced Indian art. Southeast Asian textile patterns show Indian and Chinese influences. Music and musical instruments moved along trade routes. The cultural mixing created hybrid forms that enriched all participating cultures. Those who have traveled internationally and experienced cultural exchange firsthand understand how this works. Exposure to different approaches, different solutions to similar problems, different artistic expressions. This broadens understanding and creates opportunities for innovation. Medieval merchants and their passengers experienced this continuously, and the ideas they transmitted had cumulative effects across centuries. The Maritime Silk Road wasn't just a commercial network. It was a knowledge network, a cultural transmission belt, and a catalyst for innovation. When civilizations interact peacefully through trade rather than violently through conquest, both sides benefit. Ideas that would never emerge in isolation develop when different perspectives meet. Technologies advance faster when innovations from multiple sources are combined. The modern world's interconnected nature, where ideas, technologies, and cultural practices spread globally, has roots in these medieval maritime networks. We've made it faster and more comprehensive, but the basic principle remains. When people from different places connect through peaceful exchange, everyone benefits from the encounter. The merchants who sailed these routes were motivated by profit, not cultural exchange. But the cultural exchange happened anyway, as an unintended consequence of commercial connection. And that exchange shaped the world as profoundly as any volume of silk or spices. The human story, merchants who risked everything. Behind all the economics, geography, and commercial structures were human beings, merchants who risked their capital, ships, and often their lives on ventures that might succeed spectacularly or fail catastrophically. Mariners who worked dangerous jobs for modest pay, facing storms, pirates, and navigation hazards with nothing but skill and luck to protect them. Let's bring the human element into focus. Consider a successful Chinese merchant in Canton, circa 1200. He's worked his way up from modest beginnings, perhaps starting as a clerk in his uncle's trading house, learning the business, making contacts, building a reputation for honest dealing. Eventually, he accumulated enough capital to outfit his own trading venture. He purchased a substantial cargo of silk and porcelain, hired a ship or bought shares in one, and sent it south toward the Nanyang, the South Seas, with instructions to trade for Southeast Asian goods. The risks were substantial. Pirates could take the ship. Storms could sink it. The captain might cheat, selling the cargo and disappearing. Markets might change, making the return cargo less valuable than anticipated. Navigation errors could result in shipwreck. Yet if things went well, if the ship made its destination safely, traded successfully, and returned with valuable cargo, the profit might be 50, 100, even 200% on the invested capital. Our merchant didn't sail with his cargo. Wealthy merchants stayed home managing multiple ventures simultaneously. But he had personal relationships with his captains, trusted them based on years of working together, and understood that his prosperity depended on their skill and honesty. If a captain returned with good profits, the merchant rewarded him generously, understanding that loyal, competent captains were as valuable as the ships themselves. The captain faced his own challenges. He'd invested some of his own money in the venture, so success meant personal profit beyond his salary. He was responsible for ship, cargo, and crew. Dozens of lives depended on his decisions. Navigate poorly and everyone might die. Misjudge weather and the ship founders. Skimp on maintenance and critical equipment fails at the worst moment. The weight of responsibility was constant. The crew members were mostly working men from coastal regions, raised around boats and water. Some were career sailors, spending most of their adult lives at sea. Others were seasonal, farmers or fishermen who signed on for trading voyages during off-seasons to earn extra income. They worked hard for modest pay, understood the risks, and accepted them as part of life. Those who survived accumulated skills, moved up to better positions, and eventually might become officers or even captains if they were ambitious and capable. Women participated in maritime trade primarily through family businesses. A merchant's wife often managed commercial affairs when her husband was away or deceased. Widows sometimes continued trading operations, employing captains and managing investments. Some women traveled with merchant husbands, though this was less common on long ocean passages. In port cities, women worked in industries serving maritime trade, textile production, food preparation, hospitality services, administrative work. The psychological toll of maritime trading isn't often discussed but was real. Merchants lived with constant anxiety about ventures at sea. Months might pass without news of a ship's fate. Then a returning vessel would bring letters, reports, and cargo, or news that a ship was lost with all hands. The uncertainty was difficult, particularly for families. A merchant's wife might not know if her husband was alive until a year after his departure. Parents waited for sons who'd sailed away, hoping for return but understanding that storms or pirates or disease might claim them. Those who have served overseas, particularly before modern communications, understand this. Families at home worry, imagining the worst, while those abroad deal with challenges that families never learn about. The separation strains relationships. The uncertainty about safe return weighs on everyone. Ancient merchant families faced this regularly, accepting it as the price of their livelihood. Success could be spectacular. A merchant who successfully managed multiple trading voyages over decades might accumulate substantial wealth. He'd own multiple ships, employ numerous captains and crews, maintain warehouses in several cities, and hold membership in merchant guilds that protected commercial interests. His children would marry into other merchant families, creating networks that facilitated trust and cooperation. His sons would enter the business, learning as he had learned, continuing the family enterprise. But failure was always possible. A string of bad luck, several ships lost, misjudged markets, unreliable partners could bankrupt even successful merchants. Some never recovered, falling from wealth to poverty in a few disastrous years. Others persisted, rebuilt, learned from mistakes, and eventually succeeded. The merchant class had high turnover. Families rose and fell based on skill, luck, and timing. The human motivations behind this enormous maritime network were straightforward. Profit, certainly, merchants weren't running charities, but also family obligation, providing for relatives, building legacies, ensuring children had advantages. Professional pride, being known as reliable, honest, successful. Adventure for some, the appeal of distant places and exotic encounters. And simply the satisfaction of doing something difficult well, of mastering a complex profession, of achieving success through skill and determination. Those who built successful careers or businesses understand the combination of factors required. Skill matters, but so does timing. Hard work is necessary but not sufficient. You also need some luck. Good judgment in choosing partners and employees is critical. The ability to recover from setbacks distinguishes those who ultimately succeed from those who give up. These principles haven't changed, though the specific industries have. The Maritime Silk Road functioned because enough individuals were willing to risk capital, time, and life on the possibility of profit. The accumulated result of these individual decisions was a network that connected civilizations, moved goods, transmitted ideas, and shaped history. But at its foundation were human beings making difficult choices, accepting risks, dealing with losses, and sometimes achieving success that justified everything they'd risked. When we think about ancient trade, it's tempting to focus on the grand scale, the networks, the cities, the flow of goods. But it happened because individual merchants, captains, and sailors made it happen, one voyage at a time, accepting risks that modern insurance and communications have largely eliminated. Their courage, skill, and determination deserve recognition. They built the world we inherited, even if few of their names survived in historical records. The gradual transformation and legacy. The Maritime Silk Road didn't end suddenly. It transformed gradually as new technologies, political changes, and economic shifts altered how maritime trade functioned. Understanding this transformation helps us see the connections between medieval commerce and our modern global economy. The most disruptive change was European arrival in the Indian Ocean. When Portuguese fleets reached Indian waters in the late 15th century, they didn't come as peaceful merchants seeking to participate in existing trade networks. They came as armed forces determined to control trade through military power. Within decades, Portuguese warships had established fortified bases at strategic points, Hormuz controlling the Persian Gulf, Goa on India's west coast, Malacca commanding the strait between Indian Ocean and South China Sea. The Portuguese strategy was monopolistic. They wanted to control spice trade, directing it through routes they commanded and taxing it heavily. They issued passes that merchant ships needed to carry, enforced through naval patrols that would attack and seize ships lacking proper documentation. This was fundamentally different from the medieval system, where trade was relatively free, with costs coming from tariffs at ports rather than military extortion on the open ocean. But the Portuguese never achieved complete control. The Indian Ocean was too vast, too many alternative routes existed, and indigenous merchants were too skilled at evading Portuguese patrols. What resulted was a hybrid system where Portuguese controlled some routes and ports while traditional networks continued functioning, sometimes cooperating with Portuguese, sometimes evading them, sometimes fighting against them. Following the Portuguese came the Dutch, who were even more systematic in trying to monopolize spice trade, particularly focusing on Indonesian sources. Then the British, who eventually dominated Indian Ocean commerce through the East India Company and later through direct colonial control. Each successive European power tried to channel trade through routes and systems they controlled, extracting maximum profit. Yet the fundamental geography that made the Maritime Silk Road function remained unchanged. Ships still relied on monsoon winds until steam power arrived in the 19th century. Strategic passages remained strategic. Malacca, Hormuz, Aden, and others continued as critical choke points. The goods that moved were similar: spices, textiles, and various commodities, though the specific items and proportions changed over time. The Suez Canal's opening in 1869 dramatically changed Mediterranean-Indian Ocean connections. What had required sailing around Africa or unloading at Red Sea ports and transporting overland through Egypt could now move continuously through the canal. This accelerated trade, reduced costs, and reinforced Egypt's position as critical transit point between East and West. Steam power freed ships from wind dependence. This was revolutionary. Suddenly, ships could maintain schedules regardless of seasonal wind patterns. The monsoon system that had governed maritime trade for centuries became irrelevant. Ships could travel any time of year, maintain consistent speeds, and operate on predictable timetables. This accelerated trade volumes and reduced transit times, yet the routes remained fundamentally similar. Modern shipping lanes often mirror medieval maritime routes because the same geographic factors that made those routes logical still apply. Ships traveling from East Asia to Europe still pass through the South China Sea, Strait of Malacca, Indian Ocean, and Suez Canal, essentially following the same path medieval merchants used, just much faster. The legacy of the Maritime Silk Road is visible in modern demographics and culture throughout the Indian Ocean world. The Muslim populations of Indonesia, Malaysia, and parts of the Philippines reflect religious transmission along these trade routes. The Chinese diaspora communities throughout Southeast Asia descended from medieval merchant communities that never left. The linguistic borrowings, culinary influences, and architectural styles show centuries of cultural exchange that began with maritime trade. Port cities that were important in medieval times often remain important today. Singapore occupies the same strategic position that made Malacca crucial centuries ago. Mumbai, formerly Bombay, sits where medieval Indian ports controlled maritime trade. Dubai leverages the same geographic position that made medieval Arabian ports wealthy. Modern cities build on foundations laid by medieval maritime commerce. The economic principles remain valid. Trade happens when regions have different resources or produce goods more efficiently than others. Transportation costs must be less than price differences between markets. Strategic choke points and favorable geography create commercial advantage. These principles governed medieval maritime trade and still govern global commerce today. The scale is vastly larger. Technology has transformed nearly everything, but the fundamentals haven't changed. Those who lived through the transformation from pre-container shipping to modern containerized cargo will appreciate the parallel to medieval innovations. Just as the Maritime Silk Road represented technological advancement over earlier methods, modern shipping represents advancement over earlier forms. But each improvement builds on what came before rather than completely replacing it. The cultural exchanges that characterized the Maritime Silk Road continue in modern form. Global communication moves ideas instantly rather than slowly on ships, but the principle of cultural interaction through commerce remains. When businesses engage internationally, they exchange more than just goods. They share practices, technologies, and cultural elements. This pattern is ancient, just vastly accelerated. What medieval merchants accomplished with wooden ships and sail power seems modest by modern standards of volume and speed. But they established the networks, developed the relationships, created the commercial infrastructure that made global trade possible. They proved that peaceful commercial exchange across civilizations was viable and profitable. They demonstrated that different cultures could interact productively despite differences in language, religion, and customs. When you step into a supermarket today and see spices from Asia, tea from India, coffee from Africa, goods from every corner of the world, that's the legacy of the Maritime Silk Road. When business people travel internationally to conduct commerce, following routes connecting the same regions medieval merchants connected, that's continuity across centuries. When port cities from Singapore to Dubai prosper from strategic geographic positions, that's validation of principles medieval merchants understood instinctively. The Desert Silk Road gets glory in popular imagination, but those who understand logistics and economics know the maritime routes did the heavy lifting. The sea lanes moved more goods, more efficiently, with less human suffering than the overland routes ever could. The Maritime Silk Road was the true engine of ancient global commerce, connecting civilizations through peaceful exchange, transmitting goods and ideas that shaped the world we inherited. Final reflections: what the waves remember. The ocean remembers nothing. It continues its endless rhythms, waves rising and falling, tides advancing and retreating, storms building and dissipating, completely indifferent to the human stories that played out on its surface. Yet we remember. We piece together the fragments, archaeological finds, written records, survived traditions, and reconstruct what happened on those waters centuries ago. The Maritime Silk Road wasn't a romantic adventure from popular storytelling. It was hard work, careful calculation, acceptance of risk, and persistent effort over generations. It was merchants sitting in warehouses tallying accounts, captains checking rigging before another crossing, crew members enduring weeks of monotonous routine punctuated by moments of terror when storms hit or pirates appeared. It was families waiting at home, uncertain if their loved ones would return. It was the accumulated result of thousands of individual decisions to risk everything on the possibility of profit. What strikes me most, reflecting on this vast network, is the fundamental continuity of human nature. Medieval merchants weren't different from modern business people. They responded to the same incentives, faced similar challenges, made comparable calculations. They wanted prosperity, security for their families, and perhaps a measure of success and respect. The tools were different, the technologies primitive by modern standards, but the motivations and behaviors were remarkably similar. The goods that moved along these sea lanes, silk, spices, porcelain, and all the rest, were valuable in their time. Some remain valuable today. But the true legacy wasn't the goods. It was the connections, the demonstration that different civilizations could interact peacefully to mutual benefit, the transmission of ideas and technologies that enriched every culture that participated. Think about what that means. At a time when much human interaction between different cultures was violent, conquest, war, slavery, forced conversion, The Maritime Silk Road represented an alternative. Merchants from different religions, speaking different languages, following different customs, meeting in neutral ports and conducting business based on mutual advantage and respect. It wasn't perfect. There was exploitation, there were power imbalances, there was occasional violence. But the basic system was peaceful, voluntary, and beneficial to participants. Those who lived through the Cold War's tensions, when worlds seemed divided into hostile blocs, can appreciate what peaceful commerce represents. Trade creates mutual interest in stability. Merchants who profit from exchange with foreign partners have incentive to maintain peaceful relations. Governments that derive revenue from trade tariffs want to keep trade flowing. The economic connections created through commerce create political incentives for peace. It's not guaranteed. Economic ties don't prevent all conflicts, but they reduce likelihood and severity. The mariners who risked their lives crossing these oceans weren't thinking about historical significance or cultural exchange. They were doing their jobs, trying to survive difficult conditions, working toward the next port and payment. But the accumulated result of their labor was historically significant. They connected the world, made global commerce possible, and transmitted ideas that transformed civilizations. When you think about the Silk Road from now on, I hope you'll picture something beyond desert caravans. Picture vast oceans crossed by wooden ships powered by wind and human skill. Picture merchants in Canton, Malacca, Calicut, Aden, and Alexandria, conducting business across linguistic and cultural boundaries. Picture mariners studying stars to determine position, adjusting sails to catch favorable winds, navigating by skill and experience through waters that could kill them without warning. Picture the goods that moved, silk so fine it was worth more than gold, spices that transformed cuisine across continents, porcelain that European potters couldn't duplicate for centuries. Picture the ideas that traveled with those goods, religious beliefs, technological innovations, mathematical concepts, medical treatments, architectural techniques. Picture the human drama, families saying goodbye to merchants and sailors departing on voyages that might last years, children growing up while fathers were away at sea, widows learning their husbands' ships were lost, successful merchants celebrating profitable returns, aging captains training younger men to follow in their profession. All of this happened on the ocean, that vast and largely empty space that connects rather than divides, that serves as highway rather than barrier for those with ships and skill to navigate it. The Maritime Silk Road was built on water, sustained by winds, maintained by human courage and determination across centuries. The past is gone. The ships rotted or burned centuries ago. The merchants and mariners died, their names mostly forgotten, their individual stories lost. The cities were conquered, burned, rebuilt, conquered again. Political systems rose and fell. Technologies advanced. Everything changed, except the ocean. It remains, moving to the same rhythms it followed when those ancient ships sailed its surface. The winds still blow with seasonal predictability. The currents still run along paths determined by Earth's rotation and temperature gradients. The stars still mark the same positions they held when ancient navigators used them to find their way. And humans still trade. We still connect across distances to exchange what we produce for what others produce. We still take risks in pursuit of profit. We still build ships, though they're steel now, powered by diesel, guided by GPS, and send them across the same waters to the same destinations, following the same basic routes that medieval merchants pioneered. The Maritime Silk Road never ended. It just evolved, transformed by technology while maintaining continuity of purpose. And that's perhaps the most important lesson, that human patterns once established persist across centuries. We adapt them to new technologies and circumstances, but the fundamental behaviors, Trade, risk-taking, connection across distances, exchange of goods and ideas. These remain remarkably constant. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, maybe spare a thought for those ancient mariners. They weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people doing extraordinary things because circumstances and ambition put them on the ocean in wooden ships, crossing distances that must have seemed infinite, trusting in skill they'd learned and winds they understood, pursuing profit and maybe adventure, one voyage at a time, building the connected world we inherited without ever intending to do anything except make a living and provide for their families. The waves that rocked their ships still wash the shores of those ancient ports. The winds that powered their sails still blow across those same oceans. The stars they navigated by still shine in the night sky. And somewhere in the continuity between their world and ours, in the unbroken chain of maritime commerce spanning centuries, their legacy persists. Sleep well. The ocean continues its eternal rhythms, indifferent to human concerns but essential to human connection. And in that vast indifference, we find the space to build, to risk, to connect, to trade, to share, to become more than we were. That was the gift of the Maritime Silk Road, not the goods it moved, but the connections it created and the proof it offered that humans can bridge any distance, overcome any difference if there's will and profit enough to try. The past may be silent, but it's never truly gone. It lives in the patterns we maintain, the routes we follow, the connections we sustain. And that's enough. That's legacy. That's history made present through continuity. Rest easy. The story is told. The journey is complete. And tomorrow, other ships will sail those same waters, following paths first traced by mariners who have been gone for centuries, proving that some human endeavors transcend the individuals who begin them, persisting across generations because they serve fundamental human needs that don't change no matter how much the surface appearances transform. Good night.